Can you believe we are finally getting our license in respiratory in Michigan?
We've been working a long time to attain this goal.
Let's talk to some people who've been working on this from the very beginning.
It seems as time has gone on, probably one of the longest running debates and discussions was regarding licensure of respiratory care practitioners. I know the fight for licensure goes back to the time where I started with the MSRC, which was 1979, 78, and was actually predated that by a number of years. So the push for licensure has been there for 30 years. And I sometimes think we lose sight of the fact that we've been struggling with this issue for so long, and it's finally here, but it's still a little bit of a struggle to keep on, to get this thing finally closed and working, so it's a working model.
When did you first hear about licensure?
Wow, there were rumors about it going on probably ever since I've been in the field of respiratory, way back in late 60s, but it became serious probably early mid-70s. California, I think, was the first state that actually passed a law, licensed respiratory care practitioners. Then New Mexico shortly after, and Florida wasn't too far behind. Somewhere in that time frame, the AARC became interested on a national basis and started kind of promoting the idea through the various states. And a few of us in Michigan sort of took the bait and got serious and started, formed a committee, a licensure committee with the MSRC, started working seriously in that direction to put something together for our state.
I recall quite clearly my boss at the time, Karen Shaffron, working with Jerry Iserman and Ty Grabke and a number of other individuals. Don't want to leave them unnamed, but they'll have to be because I don't remember them. Anyway, working on the initial application for licensure for respiratory therapists. And the date there was approximately 1977, 1978. They put forth the initial application to the then former Department of Licensing and Regulation, and it was taken up for study. And in 1981, Department of L&R, Licensing and Regulation, the Health Occupations Council published a study on the regulation of respiratory therapists, and their recommendation was that respiratory therapists met the criteria at that time for registration.
As a matter of fact, one of our first bills ended up becoming the model that the AARC used to put together their model for licensure that other states used to put together their licensure bills. So I think the quality of what we were doing was good early on. The environment just wasn't conducive to having it passed.
And there were some legitimate concerns about licensure from some of the sincere leadership within the respiratory therapy community. A fear that the license would kind of box you in and limit the scope. And back in the 70s and early 80s, respiratory was a growing, expanding field. And there was, I think, a very legitimate concern that license could be limiting the future potential for what respiratory care could become. So that's really dependent on how licensure bills were put together as to how much limitation it would be. But that was a real serious concern. The majority of people in the profession, the people out there in the trenches, probably were pretty skeptical. It was threatening kind of thing. There's fear. I mean, licensure means you've got to take that responsibility for yourself, and there's some rigidity to it, and that frightens people. Maybe you have to pass a test. Maybe, what if you couldn't pass the test, and so on. There's a lot of on-the-job trained people at that point, and nobody knew for sure how this thing was going to take shape. So I'd say probably a majority of people might not have been too enthused. There was this nucleus again, some of the leadership within the MSRC that felt it was a necessary endeavor to pursue. And so there was a gaining momentum, and that group trying to convince the rest of the world that licensure was a positive thing for the field.
I got involved with MSRC in 1986, and that's when I became more aware of licensure, its impact on the profession. But I don't know that the rank and file still was really appreciative of the benefits of licensure. But the MSRC, pretty much since 1981, every 2 years we've had a new bill, whether it be a licensure bill or a registration bill.
In 1985, I remember this quite clearly because that was my first year as president of the MSRC, that a number of hospitals throughout the state of Michigan were cited by the Department of Public Health in their annual surveys for cited meaning had survey issues and problems for respiratory therapists delivering aerosolized medications and respiratory therapists taking verbal orders. Now that initiative was prompted by the Michigan Nurses Association, which is working behind the scenes to basically cut the respiratory therapists, or inhalation therapists at the time, if you will, from performing those functions which they consider, the M&A, considered to be solely the province of nursing. Well, the MSRC, in its first real strong proactive effort, met with the director, the medical director of the Michigan Department of Public Health, and campaigned strongly against, in opposition to the M&A's position, and successfully argued that this was an appropriate function and responsibility of those respiratory care practitioners, and all of the citations were withdrawn. And from that point on, respiratory therapists were permitted through the MDPH to take verbal orders and to administer aerosolized medications to the respiratory tract, although there was nothing in statute that would permit those functions on an ongoing basis. In other words, they could be challenged at some point in time in the future. So it was really important then for the MSRC to go forward with legislation to put those functions in statute.
When I first got involved with the legislative piece, I've been involved since 1989, but at that time, the external forces that were not favoring licensure for respiratory therapists, the one group in particular was the Economic Alliance. It was the third-party payers. It was insurance companies, the automotive companies, and they were concerned that that the services that we would provide would be more expensive. That if we restricted the number of therapists that were available to practice, that then those who were available to practice could demand a higher salary. And to be honest, that has never borne out. When the AARC has gone back and looked at the states that had licensure and looked to see whether or not when before licensure and after licensure, whether or not there was a change in salary, there was never a cause and effect that could be pinpointed to say costs go up relative to licensure.
At any rate, between 1988 and 1994, the MSRC introduced 3 different bills in the legislature for licensure and/or registration, and there was no action taken on any of these bills. Very frustrating for us.
The legislature, the House and the Senate, was not a problem. In fact, we were probably one of the first half dozen states or so that actually submitted a bill, and it got favorable votes and so on in committees and up through the House and whatnot. But at the governor's office, it was absolutely blocked for many, many years. There was no way that the governors in Michigan would sign any kind of licensure bill for that fear that it might restrict the supply of people and drive up cost of health care, which is obviously a big issue, especially in an industrialized state like Michigan.
Our public relations, our efforts with the lobbyists, I think were very effective in getting the MHA to at least be neutral on our bills. the Economic Alliance was no longer opposing our efforts. I think we did a good job with the legislature. Most of the senators and representatives all thought that if anyone deserved licensure, respiratory therapy as a profession deserved it. But there was an 8-year period where at the governor's level that there was the perception of privatizing services, not taking on more services, and trying to put more of the things in the private sector. And it wasn't, to be honest, I think, until the new governor came in where that climate changed that we were able to move forward with this most recent bill.
And in 1998, though, we sponsored a bill for registration that passed the House of Representatives in the state, passed the Senate, and was ready to, I was so excited. Both houses, both chambers approved it. We were so excited. It was ready to go back to the House for concurrence, but unfortunately it got stalled. The legislative session ended before concurrence was able to be achieved, and we were fairly devastated, actually, but that was basically political maneuvering. However, in 2001-2002 legislative session, the MSRC put forth another registration bill, and keep in mind that we're fine-tuning this legislation, trying to get a best fit every year, every different legislative session. This went through both chambers, the House and the Senate, was passed by both, was concurred upon by both, and was vetoed by our illustrious governor. And that, of course, was fairly devastating, and that was his last effort before his term limit, and we were rather happy to see that happen.
The problem was with the governor and that office and that economic consideration. I think when our recent Democratic governor was elected, Governor Granholm, the philosophy changed a bit. The emphasis or the focus was more on the social needs of the members of the citizens of the state of Michigan than on the economic considerations. So the information kind of bubbled out of the politics in Lansing, and the door was open for this type of legislation. And I think it was passed within the first year of Governor Granholm's
Election.
Yeah.
In 2003, we went forward, we had a new governor, went forward with another piece of legislation, House Bill 4236, which was sponsored by Representative Stephen Ehart, who is a registered pharmacist and was very supportive of respiratory therapists and the work we do. He went forward with the registration bill, passed the House. When it got to the Senate, Senator Beverly Hammerstrom, who's chair of the Senate Health Policy Committee, on her own, changed the legislation from registration to licensure. It was wonderful. Senator Hammerstrom was, again, another very strong supporter of respiratory therapists in the state of Michigan. That bill, as we all know, went on to become approved and passed the Senate, passed the House, was concurred upon, and went to the governor's office for Governor Granholm's approval. There were some problems there. It was not a rubber stamp by the governor's office. The biggest problem is the governor recognized some of the issues nationally with continuing education, and that continuing education is receiving a lot of scrutiny on a national level for basically being non-competency based, cruises, dinner, meetings, etc., and not really as a whole, as a product, validated in producing demonstrable improvements in clinical skills and clinical outcomes. It is a non-competency based process. So we negotiated with the governor, knowing that she had a model project on the table to develop a competency-based continuing education process in the state of Michigan that would be a model for all healthcare professions. As part of our negotiations, we agreed to withdraw the CEU requirement out of our licensure bill, provided that she agreed to use respiratory therapists, licensed respiratory therapists, as the model group for her pilot project to develop a competency-based CEU program. And her office did agree to that, and we got the job done. We pulled the CEU language out. The Governor Granholm signed the bill, and the rest is history. It is now public act.